Hello everyone and welcome to the endocrinology section. So let's get started. Well, our first question, the first thing we need to tackle are what are hormones? So hormones are organic chemical messengers that are going to be produced and released by special glands. That's your definition, right? And one of the key things, and we'll see this again, is that they're going to be released into the bloodstream and they may act on a target organ some distance away from the origin. Now we'll talk about different types of signaling. Some are more local or closer or even within a cell, and some are some distance away. But that's the key, that some hormones go into the bloodstream and then they can affect a tissue much, much farther away than where they themselves are located. Hormones can also coordinate the physiology and the behavior of an animal. So what this basically means is that the same hormone that may cause one effect to occur in the physiological sense will also influence the behavior. So the example given is that some hormones that cause gamete maturation, gametes being eggs or sperm, also stimulate mating behavior in many species, right? In lots of different animals. And it's basically the same thing is true in humans. Testosterone, estrogen, right, allow us to go through puberty, so there's very clear physiological changes that occur that lead to the maturation of the gametes, and they also lead to differences in behavior. So as I mentioned, there's different ways that different hormones will communicate, and basically the difference is how far away from the cell that's producing the hormone is the other tissue that is being affected. Hopefully that made sense to you. So going down this list, it's going from intracrine, which means that the hormone acts inside a cell. So the cell creates a hormone. It doesn't actually leave the cell. However, it regulates intracellular events. Insulin is one of those examples. Autocrine refers to hormones that are released outside a cell, but then they bind to receptors on the surface of that cell. Again, insulin works in that way to basically upregulate the cell's absorption of sugar. Paracrine refers to a hormone that is released outside a cell and then acts on nearby cells without actually entering the bloodstream. Okay. Now, testosterone can work in a paracrine fashion within the testes by regulating sperm production. So the cells that produce the testosterone go on to affect the sperm cells that are adjacent to them. They don't necessarily just have to go into the bloodstream. However, it does do that as well. So testosterone will also work in an endocrine fashion, meaning that it is released outside of a cell into the bloodstream and may act on a cell some distance away. So testosterone has masculinizing effects, for example, like on things like bones and muscles and cartilage and things like that, or even hair, things like that. So again, it can act in a paracrine or in an endocrine fashion. It just depends on where in the body we're talking about it. And then you probably have heard of pheromones. So these are chemical signals used to communicate with other animals, with another individual, and they may trigger specific behaviors. So this is most obvious in a lot of animals, right? They release pheromones to attract a mate, which then usually triggers that mating response. There is some discussion whether or not humans secrete pheromones. There have been a number of studies looking at that. They look at people will wear different a different shirt every day of the month, and then they will rate the scent of that shirt depending on either the woman's where the woman is in her reproductive cycle. So let me say that in a slightly different way. So they'll have a guy wear a shirt. They'll ask, work out, kind of have a scent on it. And then depending on where the woman is in her menstrual cycle, she will often change her rating of what the scent is like, if it's more attractive or less attractive. Similarly, they'll ask women to wear a different shirt throughout their menstrual cycle, and they'll ask guys to rate the scent of it, and men tend to favor, or there's some studies at least that have shown that men tend to favor the scent of the shirt when the woman is ovulating. So even though they can't tell, consciously, they just say, yeah, this smells better, or this is less stinky maybe. But there seems to be some suggestion that we are able to pick up on pheromones, if not as obviously as some other animals, but there is a sort of a hint to that. Okay, so what are some other features of the endocrine system? So there's a few key things. Number one, endocrine glands do not have ducts. Remember, exocrine glands have ducts, right? Because the idea is with exocrine glands, you want whatever they are producing to go to a specific spot. Saliva needs to go to the mouth, not into the bloodstream, not nearby, to the mouth. So you put a duct. Tears, right? Lacrimal gland, exocrine gland. Tears need to go to your eyes. So you create ducts, so it goes specifically there. Pancreas had ducts, because again, you need to deliver those digestive enzymes to the duodenum, not anywhere else. However, with endocrine glands, again, they're ductless, so they can release their hormones into the bloodstream. And since pretty much every single tissue is supplied by the bloodstream, in theory, like the hormone can get to any cell in the body, right? So you can help coordinate an effect throughout the body all at once, because again, blood kind of flows, well, not kind of, it does flow throughout the body, right? So again, hormones secrete into bloodstream. There are no ducts. So because they have to secrete their hormones into the bloodstream, there's obviously a very rich blood supply. As I mentioned, again, blood travels to virtually every cell in the body. Excuse me, so hormones can affect virtually any cell in the body. But the key thing is that the only way a hormone will have an effect on a cell is if the cell has a receptor for that hormone. Okay, so that's one way that the body can regulate what cells are affected by what hormone, right? So if there's no receptor, there is no effect. Okay, I cannot stress that highly enough. So let me give you a very specific example. So we have receptors, capsaicin receptors in our mouths and throughout our digestive tract that are specific for, that hot chili pepper, that capsaicin molecule. So that's what makes it really hot. So there are some people that they have a mutation that they actually don't have the receptor. So they can eat the hottest ghost chili pepper and it will have no effect. Like it just tastes like a regular pepper to them without the spice. Similarly, they're also missing those receptors like in their eyes and other parts of the mucous membrane. So if you were to pepper spray them, it wouldn't feel like pepper spray to them. It would just feel like a wet mist that you're spraying in their face. So again, if you don't have the receptor, there is no effect, right? And if you guys remind me, I'll tell you a story about peppers and how we believe capsaicin to have evolved. And for what purpose. So remind me when I get back. Okay. We have 4 classes of hormones. They're peptide or protein class. There's a monoamine, a steroid, and a lipid-based hormone. Basically, the peptide, protein, and the monoamines are going to work very similarly because these are water-soluble. Both of those are water-soluble or hydrophilic. They cannot pass through the plasma membrane, so the receptors for these types of hormones have to be on the cell membrane. So these are integral membrane proteins. And they're going to act as a first messenger, meaning once that receptor binds the hormone, it then goes on to basically acts as a relay system to relay it to a secondary messenger, which relays it to another one, So what you end up seeing is like one hormone, one molecule will trigger many different secondary messengers, which then trigger a big pathway, which will then activate many proteins. So the nice thing about this, so even though this hormone can't get across the cell, one molecule of this hormone can have a very big effect in the cell. So you don't have to actually produce a lot of it because the signal is amplified so greatly. And then with steroids and lipid-based hormones, these will function, again, similarly. Because they're lipid-based, they can go across the phospholipid bilayer and into the cell. So that means their receptor is not on the surface of the cell, but usually on the surface or actually inside the nucleus of the cell. And well, if it's going to the nucleus of the cell, basically the big thing that's in the nucleus, right, is going to be DNA. So basically what most steroid and lipid-based hormones are going to do is they're going to turn on or off specific genes, right? So that basically means by turning on or off specific genes, you can control the production of new proteins. And then these new proteins will then alter the cell's activity. So in this case, they don't have that, these do not have the amplification effect that the peptide or monoamines had. However, again, these can go right through the cell membrane of the cell, directly to the nucleus, directly affecting, again, the specific genes. So those are the two sort of, well, the four classes, the main difference between the two sort of groupings of them and how they function. All right, and then hormones can, right, they can influence one another in different ways. So the first way is the permissive effect. So what this means is one hormone induces the production of receptors for a second hormone, or otherwise brings about the conditions necessary for the second hormone to be effective, right? So you have to have the first one in order for the second one to really work. So for example, thyroid hormone was going to increase the number of receptors for epinephrine and thereby enhancing epinephrine's effect on the heart, right? So thyroid hormone helps the functioning of epinephrine by a great deal, right? So it's a permissive effect. Synergistic is where two hormones act together, basically at the same time. So it's not like you have to have one first and then the other, but they work together for a greater effect. So if you remember back when we talked about the digestive system, we talked about gastrin and histamine. And if you remember back to the gastric phase of secretion, histamine and gastrin both stimulate together the acid and enzyme secretions in the stomach, right? So they work together for an even greater effect than if any one of them were secreted by themselves. And then there's also antagonistic effects. So these hormones have opposite effects. So a classic one is insulin and glucagon. Right, so insulin is going to be responsible for taking sugar out of the bloodstream and into cells, and glucagon works in the exact opposite way, where sugar is released from the cells into the bloodstream. Okay, in general, these are how hormones interact with one another. They either, again, set up a situation for another one to work even better, or sometimes work at all. They work together to do a thing, or they're going to work in opposite fashions to one another to help regulate a process. Okay, now how do we control how hormones are secreted? Well, we can have neural control, so meaning we have direct nervous system control to something. You can have hormonal control, like one hormone causes the release of another hormone, or humoral, meaning that there's some condition in the bloodstream that causes the release of a hormone. So again, insulin would be the prime example. The presence of glucose causes the release of insulin, right? So it's something in the bloodstream. It's not a neuron firing saying release. It's not another hormone telling a second hormone to release. Again, it's humoral, some condition in the bloodstream that then causes a release of the hormone. Most of our hormones are in a negative feedback control, right? So that's the most common control mechanism for hormone secretion. That's your classic thermostat. So if there's a condition that is not being met, a hormone is being released until that condition now is met, in which case now the production of that hormone shuts back down until, again, the levels get low enough where it needs to be released. It gets high enough, it gets shut down. So again, that's that negative feedback. But the release of it and the increase of its presence essentially shuts its own production down until levels get low enough. Again, most of the hormones work this way. Positive feedback control basically means that whatever change the hormone brings about causes even more of the hormone to be released. So it's this real upcycle of release of the hormone. So the classic example there, and we'll talk a lot more about this too when we get to the reproductive systems, is going to be contractions and oxytocin, right? So basically, as a baby is being born, the head pushes on the cervix. That stretching of the cervix causes oxytocin to be released, which causes uterine contractions, helping push the baby out. That push and that movement of the baby causes more oxytocin, more pushing, more oxytocin, more pushing, more oxytocin. And this is a big feedback loop until contractions get stronger and stronger until baby and the placenta are expelled. And then that's how that loop shuts down because there's no more stretching, so there's no more release of oxytocin, so the contractions die down. In general, we're not going to talk, well, let me say it this way. We're not going to talk about a lot of disorders. There's a lot of disorders that can happen from a dysregulation of the endocrine system. They tend to be very complex and sometimes contraindicatory of one another. However, as a very sweeping statement, pretty much any disorder we're going to see that we will look at or you'll encounter later on will either involve the hyposecretion, too little secretion of a hormone, or hypersecretion, too much secretion of a hormone. For some reason, the body has somehow lost the ability to properly regulate the amounts. All right, so that's one of our stopping points. I'll stop this video here. If you have any questions, please let me know. And then after this, we'll get into some endocrine glands and what they do.